I will apologize, we switched to English. My vocabulary in French may be not sufficient for this presentation. I will speak slowly.
Thank you.
But I try to keep to the time slot. Okay. I've been presenting several presentations on Antwerp before. We have talked about 15th and 16th century Antwerp in particular. And as you know, with the Dutch revolt in the 16th century, Antwerp lost its major position as an international port, especially due to the so-called closure of the River Scheldt, which was just a frontier running through the River Scheldt, which made that ships had to pay taxes and had to load over their cargo to Dutch ships. So it was not any more attractive for merchants to come to Antwerp itself. And it is Amsterdam that takes over the role of the major gateway in the North Sea area. And for Antwerp, we have now a period of about 200 years of commercial stagnation. And it's not by sympathy that say it's under the rule of Napoleon and the French rule in Antwerp that Antwerp rises again as a port, principally because it was thought to be a naval base of the French against the English, a gun on the head of the English. And at the same time, they tried to establish also free trade on the Scheldt once again, which was, of course, the major innovation and the major chance for Antwerp to recover its former position. Well, now we enter the period of research after 1815. We get a new government, we get a king, the king of the Netherlands. Actually, we speak of the United Kingdom of the Netherlands under William I. And this opens new perspectives for the port of Antwerp, because we have now free trade with the Netherlands and its colonies, whereas before Antwerp was excluded of this commercial trade. And we now see that there is actually an increasing port activity and an economic revival of the city. I have here a citation in French. Depuis 1814, les affaires ont pris plus d'extension et ne peuvent que gagner à fur et à mesure que le gouvernement développera ses vues bienveillantes. So everybody was hoping for a revival of the port, but of course the king was not the only political authority in the port of Antwerp, because we have on the one hand the central government, which tries really to impose its views and its centralized policies. We have also a provincial government in between, but there's a strong tradition of urban autonomy in Antwerp, and the town council and the aldermen, they try to continue their political interference or their autonomous policy in the port. There's also another player, the Chamber of Commerce, a recent establishment, which has basically advisory function for commercial affairs, but also takes its own initiatives and also invests money in some projects. We will see this later on. There is another person, the port captain, which is a government official and who has to supervise affairs of the port. And here we see that on the one hand we have the urban government, who has of course in mind the own local development, the port development, the economy of Antwerp, but there are conflicting interests with other ports within the kingdom, Amsterdam and Rotterdam, and here the central government of course has to establish a balance between the interests of these different ports. If we come to the financial administration, we can see this interaction between different authorities. If we look at the budget, which is proposed by the town magistrate, the alderman and the mayor, which is then presented to the council, a budget commission of the council, goes to the provincial estates who have to agree to it, and then it goes up to the central government. We have a superintendent and an intendant and a general commissioner of internal affairs, and at last instance it's the king who actually has to agree to all the decisions, budgetary commission decisions. This is of course a very arduous way, a very complicated way to have the budget decided, and we see also in practice that there are some points where government policy is prevailing and others where the local interests could actually be defended. If we look on the budget, well, the main types of expenses are, of course, administration, public security, poor relief, religion, schools, and then we have public debt and extraordinary expenses. But maybe we go to one of the first problems, and then I'm referring back to former times when in 16th century Antwerp was this big city, this big commercial center. There was one major problem arising, which is a huge public debt. Huge public debt, which was carried through these 200 years of economic decline, because public debt is very can be bearable if there is sufficient incomes and sufficient taxes, but in this period it was very hard to pay off this public debt. Furthermore, there was a famine and a major social crisis in 1816 to 17, which was felt in whole Europe actually, which made things more difficult. So a large part of the public finances had to be invested in a plan for redemption of the public debt. And this was done by royal decree. The king really wanted to have clean public finances, and he installed amortization funds, which was installed also on the national level, and at the same time he wanted to have this amortization done also in Antwerp. And the problem was for all the financial balance that the urban taxes were not anymore part of urban autonomy, but now were decided by central government regulations. So whenever the urban government wanted to raise new taxes, they had to negotiate with the central state. So we can see, for example, in the question of dock rights, which were a major source of income for the urban government, they also had to balance between the interests of financial needs of the city, but on the other hand, policy of stimulating trade. So Antwerp traditionally had low dock rights in order to attract merchants, but at the same time they needed the funds to actually work in the port. So if we come to the budgetary speech of here, this is the mayor, Eduard van Erdborn. For example, he says, the incomes in general developed favorably in 1827 due to the major growth of trade and navigation, the growth of the population and an increasing wealth in certain classes. The excise is increased by 7,000 pounds and the harbour rights by 11,000. But also the needs of the poor relief increased and will require a higher subsidy. And also the payment of interests increased by 4,000 pounds. Therefore, there will not be any room for extraordinary expenses. So things are going well, but costs were rising. So in concrete figures, this is how it looked like. These are the incomes. So the main part comes from local taxes, and these are rights from, for example, the dock rights, which are the second layer. Then we have subsidies from the central government, some incomes from urban patrimony, and there's also the recompensation of France from the occupation. So the incomes are rising throughout this period between 1815 and 1830, from about 450,000 pounds to 720. So this is a considerable rise. If we come to the expenses, I have to translate this, I guess. A major part, so these are by order of total size, the major part is going to poor relief, and especially in this period of crisis between 1816 and 1817, poor relief really is a very strong part. Then we have public works, and this is where the port comes in. This is public debt. This is the period where the big amortization project is going through. Then we have administration. These are arrear payments. This is security. This is public schools, military, light blue. Then religion, a small one. This has to do with a church building. We come to public works. This is the percentage. Percentage is going from 20%, a bit beneath 20%, up to 25% in the best years after 1825. And then we split up these public works in different sectors. So the major part of the public works is going to the port. And here we have to say that the port actually was part of the public domain of the city. So the city had to pay for its own investments in public in the port. Then also public lights. This was the second biggest point. Surprising. Gas lighting was one of the big projects of urbanization in this period. Then we have the purchase of real estate. We have the re-establishment of the urban canals. Pavement of streets, public buildings, repair of public buildings, the building of a hospital. And then if we go further up, a theater, a new church, schools, and finally promenades and botanical gardens. So it's a quite large spread of different projects, but the basis is the works on the port itself. This is, of course, not a photo from the early 19th century, but a bit later. But this is how the port looked like in the 19th century. One of the big investments in the new port was the finishing of the new docks. The new docks had been built under the government of Napoleon. They were thought of as a military port, but after 1815 it was used as the new basis for the commercial port. In 1815 the docks became property of the city, but they were unfinished. So the city had to invest a lot for establishing and to finishing these docks. They had to be dredged regularly, bridges had to be installed, new quays had to be built all around the docks, and there was also a new iron crane which was built with financial support of the Chamber of Commerce. And there were whole negotiations about this new crane that the government said, well, we don't have actually the money to build this. And finally, the Chamber of Commerce said, well, we buy it, and then you buy it off from us on a long range. When we speak of the port, of course, it was not only the docks, which are here on the north side of the city, but there were also the, let's say, the former canals through the city, which were interior ports, and of course the quay of the River Scheldt, which was the traditional old port of the city. And throughout the accounts we also see that port activity and port investments also had to be done on the other traditional parts of the Antwerp port. So for example, the so-called fleets had to be repaired because they were in a very bad shape, and new quays had to be built along the fleets also. So there were port works not only in the docks but also in different parts of the old port. Then we come to the public lights. We can see throughout the city that new lanterns were situated, and then there were experiments with gas lighting, which was a new innovation, of course, and it was interesting to see in these costs that public lighting really was a big cost for the city. And it was also a question of security, of course, which was involved in that. Then we had buildings of public schools. There were also quite some new projects of schools that were here established. We have all kinds of plans concerning that. We see the new hospital, military quarters, and then there's some, let's say, prestigious new building projects like the Royal Theatre, which is still existing today, one of the most attractive places still in Antwerp. Here we have the serre in the botanical garden, the orangerie, which was also part of this whole project. So one of the principles of public government was we have the necessary before the util, and then the agreeable. So this was the hierarchy of spending. We say the necessary, the practical, and the attractive parts. Of course, we have all kinds of maintenance works. Public buildings which had been in a very bad shape after this period of economic malaise was now reinvested. So they planted new trees here on the public promenade, as they said. The town hall was repaired. So there were all kinds of maintenance works also. And we can see that finally in 1830 things were going fairly well in Antwerp. But now we got the Belgian Revolution. Belgium had trouble with this United Kingdom, especially the artisans. They really wanted more independence. There was a revolutionary movement, but Antwerp was really called the so-called Orangists. Antwerp was faring quite well under the government of William I, and here we got a very nice declaration saying l'expérience de 15 années nous a prouvé de la manière la plus évidente que c'est à l'échange mutuel et libre de produits que l'on doit la prospérité réciproque. Les avantages que la navigation a retirés du commerce avec les colonies, les débouches que ces-mêmes colonies offrent chaque jour de plus à votre industrie sont une preuve irréfragable que toute séparation serait funeste, non seulement à cette province, mais à l'industrie et au commerce de la Belgique entière. So, the Belgian Revolution ended for Antwerp a period of welfare in a certain way. And it would take some decades until this fracture has healed, and Antwerp once again in the 1860s would buy the passage rights on the River Scheldt and got a new period of industrialization and port development, which maybe can be discussed in another colloquium next year or in 2 years or whatever. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.